It's been about a month since the projectile war has been ongoing in West Asia. While the US and Israel are waging this war for many declared reasons, including regime change and Iran's missile capabilities, an often cited factor is the Iranian nuclear program. Now, for decades, Iran's nuclear program has caused consternation in Western capitals. In the past, multiple attempts were made to reach a negotiated deal that scuttled the possibility of Iran getting its hands on nuclear weapons. And even cyber means have been reported to be used for this purpose. But since last year, US and Israel have resorted to directly bombing Iranian nuclear sites. So, despite all of these Western efforts over the decades, Iran has managed to get to a stage where it has about 440 kgs of 60% enriched uranium, which, if it is enriched to about 90%, is sufficient for about, let's say, 9 to 10 weapons based on uh, international reports. So, in this particular special edition of All Things Policy on Iran, we would be discussing the Iranian nuclear program in much more detail. And we'll be discussing the past, present, and future of the Iranian nuclear program. And to do so, I have with me Aditya Ramanathan and Adya Madhavan. Aditya is an expert military historian and heads Takshishila's Advanced Military Technologies and Outer Space Program. Adya is a military tech and strategic affairs researcher at Takshashila. And I'm Lokendra Sharma. I'm a tech geopolitics researcher with Takshashila. So, Aditya, let's kick off this discussion from where it all started, right? Why did and when did Iran first decide to get its hands or even think about nuclear weapons?
Yeah, so if you would actually consider when it started, it would actually go back to the 70s, to the time of the Shah, when Iran initiated a nuclear program. And Iran's nuclear program has always been driven by a mix of both strategic requirements and prestige, a self-image of what Iran is as an ancient civilization and the likes. And I think that continues into the current government. Uh, the minds of the Iranians were concentrated on this matter after the war with Iraq from 1984 to 88. The Iraqis used chemical agents against Iranian forces multiple times. They used mustard gas, but also tabun, sarin, possibly VX as well. Uh, this culminated in 1988 with the Halabja massacre, in which both Kurds and Iranians were killed. And so after that war, the Iranians seem to have decided that they should at least keep the option open of retaining nuclear weapons as some kind of deterrent. And sometime in the 90s, they started a secret program. There's good reasons for them for it to be secret. You don't want to
Yeah,
attract the
yeah.
attention of other countries. Ideally, you would like to present them with a fait accompli of some sort. Uh, and then we come to the year 2002. And in January of 2002, uh, President George W. Bush makes his Axis of Evil speech, where he identifies three countries: Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. And at that time, nobody, knowledge of Iran's nuclear program was not public. People knew about Iraq's aborted program, uh, North Korea's surreptitious program, but not much was known about Iran. It was a little later that year when supposedly an Iranian dissident group released information about two Iranian facilities. One was a heavy water facility for potentially processing plutonium, and another facility for uranium. Now, this was almost certainly fed to them by American intelligence, but that's how the exposure happened. Uh, and this is all, remember, this is just barely a year after 9/11, and in March 2003, the I'll start say that again. In March 2003, the Americans invade Iraq, and this is a moment of crisis for the Iranians, because American rhetoric has been about transforming the entire region, not just Iraq. There are Americans who are talking about let's march on Damascus and let's march on Tehran. I think there's a really silly quote that is doing the rounds at that time. Everybody wants to go to Baghdad, real men want to go to Tehran, right? So that sort of rhetoric was going on in the United States. And you know, this was a fairly serious crisis for the Iranians, and they decided, let's play ball. Let's figure out what we can get. And it helped certainly that the president at that time was Mohammad Khatami, who was a reformer. Uh, and so the Iranians actually proposed some sort of grand bargain with the Americans,
Okay.
which is, look, we will wind down support for Hamas. We will push Hezbollah to be a regular political party in Lebanon. We will put our nuclear program under IAEA safeguards. And in return, they wanted some things. They wanted their assets abroad to be frozen. They wanted a removal of American sanctions. And they wanted a broader recognition of Iran's role in the world, especially in that region. They also came to a agreement with the so-called E3. The E3 countries were the UK, France, and Germany, which under which they agreed to what they called an additional protocol, in which the IAEA would be able to basically do more intrusive inspections in Iran of its nuclear program.
What did they get back in return for that?
The thing is, they made this agreement under the understanding that it would result in sanctions relief and the likes. That never happened.
That never happened.
Yes, the Americans essentially said, no, we're not interested. This is, we don't trust the Iranians on this. It certainly didn't help that the Undersecretary for Arms Control at that time was John Bolton, who was a known Iran hawk. So, it never really happened. And then after that, you have a period where the Iranians have essentially come to the conclusion that they just have to continue their program as surreptitiously as possible, and maybe get to a point where a deal is, they can come to a negotiated agreement at some point in the future. And this is also the period in which, the US starts to get into more and more trouble in Iraq. And this is not entirely, this is also, Iran and Syria have a lot to do with this, because those two countries have concluded that if the Americans have too much of an easy time, they're just going to get more adventurous. So, Iran certainly starts supporting the Shia militias in southern Iraq. Iran has, very old connection with that area. Families are interlinked. There's cultural overlap. There are important Shia sites in southern Iraq and stuff like that, like Najaf. So they start supporting that insurgency, and eventually, that's part of the reason the Americans are in hot water at this time. And in 2011, the Americans decide they complete their effective withdrawal from most of Iraq. There are some forces that remain. Now, at the same time, the Americans and Israelis are not standing still. From 2007 onwards, you have a campaign of assassinations against Iranian nuclear scientists. Some are by shooting, some are by bombings. 2010, as you know, the Stuxnet attack on the Natanz facilities becomes public.
So we don't know how long and what duration it ran.
We don't exactly know when it happened, but it becomes public in 2010.
Correct.
And this campaign of assassinations continues for a long time, and you also start seeing a winding up of sanctions again. So from about until about 2009, from 2005 to 2009, even the Europeans are easing off a bit on the Iranians. They're using so-called smart sanctions and the likes.
But US was not easing.
Not the US, right? No, but ultimately these sanctions work when it's a multilateral thing.
Yeah.
So, and then from that starts to change. One is that Iran suppresses the Green Movement, which is a reformist movement in 2009. The other is that Iran's nuclear program is clearly progressing, and Iran is playing hardball with the IAEA. So, from 2012 onwards, the EU also starts strengthening their sanctions.
So before Aditya, before we go to 2012 onwards, I think it's useful to take a quick pause and just reflect on 1970s to 2000s. Like, I think this is roughly 40 years of period. So based on what you've said, I understand Shah of Iran, before he's deposed, first shows interest in nuclear, and then during Iran-Iraq war, that interest is renewed by the Islamic regime there, and then in 90s some developments happen. In 2000s, early 2000s, Iran is giving some concessions
Yes.
on IAEA and additional protocol and things like that. In return, during that 10-year period or so, it is getting some returns. Maybe Europe is easing some things, but US on the other hand is not giving anything in return for those concessions. So
Yes.
this is a lingering institutional sort of memory with which now Iran will act in 2010s. Is that a
Yes.
correct
Yeah,
way?
it
Yeah.
is certainly the case that they know that that it's much harder to work the Americans,
Okay.
right? Uh, but they're still willing to make a deal, which is
Okay.
why 2013 onwards you have negotiations.
Yeah.
This time it's the so-called P5+1, where you
Yeah.
have the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and Germany
Hmm.
involved in direct talks with the Iranians.
Hmm.
So Jawad Zarif, who was foreign minister, Ali Larijani, who just passed away recently, was killed. All of these people are involved in these talks. And the JCPOA, it comes into effect in 2015, and it basically places it basically restricts Iran's nuclear program to a level where it's very hard to
So
weaponize.
JCPO is Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or something.
Yes,
It's a
it's
long name,
yes, it's a long
and
name,
and it's
named by
something that
committee.
Obama, I think, personally invests himself in as
Absolutely.
you. Okay.
Yeah. So the Obama administration is
Hmm.
definitely committed to coming to some sort of
Hmm.
deal with Iran.
Hmm.
Now, it's interesting you bring this up because
Hmm.
uh, the JCPOA is sold in general as a strictly arms control agreement, which
Okay.
is, look, we're not trying to become besties with Iran.
Hmm.
We're just trying to limit their nuclear program.
Okay.
And yes, that's true. But as we know, arms control is rarely just about arms control. It's often part of a broader detente process
Hmm.
between countries.
Hmm.
And that was the case here to some extent because
Hmm.
one of the things that JCPOA would do is that it would ease off sanctions.
Yeah.
And so, if you were in support of better relations between Iran and the West, that was great news. But if you were Israel, if you were Saudi Arabia, this became a matter of concern. And you know, it also matters that JCPOA very intentionally did not look at other. It was very narrowly focused on Iran's nuclear program.
So it didn't look at missile and other capabilities.
It placed no limitations on Iran's missiles,
Hmm.
including nuclear capable missiles.
Hmm.
And it, of course, had nothing, it was not about, Iran's broader behavior. It wasn't about proxies
Okay.
and the likes. Now, for these countries, that was a matter of concern. Their idea was that, well, Iran is basically, it's getting off easy.
Hmm.
Iran, yes, they might have to restrict their nuclear program for now, but, for example, they can produce the delivery systems for their nuclear weapons. They can do all that sort of thing. So that you know that lingering concern remained, and it didn't take long for JCPOA to fall apart.
Hmm.
Donald Trump basically decertified the deal in 2018.
Hmm.
The reasons given are very flimsy. Somewhere there was some slight. The Iranians slightly exceeded their enrichment limit, but,
Yeah.
but these are like almost like technical details within a margin of error. But it was ultimately a political decision.
I
And
think if I recall correctly from that time, Trump was saying again and again that this was a bad deal. Obama negotiated a bad deal. So he made it about his predecessor and how Trump would get a better deal out of Iran. So he added that personal angle to it, as he has added to a lot of foreign policy bit. But also, Aditya, correct me if I'm wrong here. I felt that whatever international experts and analysis I've read over the last few years on why Trump walked out of JCPO and why he, sort of killed the deal. Uh, there have been some post facto justifications, but I've not been able to get fully convinced as to this was a very thought out strategic sort of approach towards Iran with all the implications of it mapped out. Because I think Trump walking out of JCPOA has had implications till 2026, right? We are still Israel and US are right now engaged in suppressing or uh, taking out Iran's ability to develop nuclear weapons. So 10 years maybe they signed the deal in 2015 and we are
Yes.
in 2026 now. So it's been 10, 11 years and still we're stuck with the same things. So it's not very clear to me that this was a thought through move with implications, long term implications mapped out based on what we're observing now. Do you sort of agree with that?
So imagine if you're Iranian,
Yeah.
after the Americans walk out of the JCPOA
Yeah.
deal, why would you trust them?
Yeah.
Why would you go and bother to negotiate with them again?
Yeah.
Because even if you come to a new deal, they can
Hmm.
always walk out of it again.
Hmm.
And there's been a consistent pattern where the Americans have not uh, been willing to come to some sort of compromise with Iran.
Okay.
And each time, what's happened is that it leaves Iran in a better position than it was in the past, at least
Okay.
in terms of its nuclear
Okay.
program. I think after 2025, maybe some of that has changed.
Yeah.
But we'll come to that. Iran's motivations have also,
Hmm.
they've sharpened.
Hmm.
So I think it's fair to say that the American policy has been grossly misjudged,
Hmm.
and the result of that has been both that Iran has felt the need to continue to advance its nuclear
Hmm.
program, and also that the hostilities between the two countries have just continued.
Okay, I think thanks, Aditya. I think we have covered a broad scope, uh, historical view of why Iran thought about nuclear and what steps it took towards it, what West and US tried to do to scuttle that. Now let's transition to the present, right? And by present, I mean roughly developments that have happened in the last year or so. So, and Adya, maybe you can pitch in here. So, last year in, I think it was June in 2025, when there was a 12-day war, and again, Israel, US, and Iran were involved in shooting projectiles, so on and so forth. So, and at that time, I think they bombed some nuclear facilities. So, can you tell us a bit more as to what happened during that 12-day war?
Okay, so to give you some context, the 12-day war, in I think early last year, the IAEA started to report that Iran had begun enriching its uranium and enriching it fast. It had gone up to 60%, which is much closer to weapons grade than, the JCPOA limits. And it was at this time that the US and Israel panicked. Israel, of course, cites this as an existential threat. It's always perceived Iran's nuclear program to be a direct uh, threat to its own sovereignty and survival. And I think Israel sort of Israel spearheaded that operation. The United States under President Trump has been quick to jump on the bandwagon with things like this, I think. And multiple enrichment facilities were hit at the time, including Natanz. So at the time, the White House declared that Iranian sites were obliterated.
Hmm.
But the IAEA did say then that, although the above ground structures
Hmm.
and power supplies may have been destroyed to some extent, you cannot destroy underground centrifuge halls. And although there may have been operational disruption to some of these things, there was also no way of telling where the location of Iran's enriched uranium was and what state it was in.
Hmm.
Now then again, before the 12-day war, negotiations had opened, I think, early in 2025 in Oman, but after the war, those negotiations completely fell through.
Hmm.
And later that year, I think Germany, France, and the UK triggered this snapback mechanism, which
Hmm.
means that because of so the JCPOA lifted pre-2015 sanctions, but because Iran wasn't meeting its commitments anymore, the sanctions were reinstated. And as retaliation for that, Iran suspended most of its cooperation with the IAEA, which then, left the international community pretty much with a blind spot. They had no idea what was happening.
Hmm.
The IAEA typically has access to camera feeds, they have inspectors on the ground,
Hmm.
they have multiple tools that they use for detection. None of this was operational anymore. And I think that actually set off some of this dangerous escalation that's taken place in the
Hmm.
last couple of months, because the US and Israel could now make these claims. The IAEA had no way of disputing these claims as they would have been able to if they did have people on the ground.
Hmm.
And because of that, I think it was very easy for the negotiations that took place earlier this year to fall through as well.
So, okay, last year, and you pointed this obliterated word out, right? And Trump was making it a point to emphasize it again and again in multiple speeches that Iran's nuclear program has been obliterated, when in reality they did that heavily struck some facilities, but not fully eliminated all the possibilities that Iran has, right, and all the facilities that Iran possibly has. And I was seeing some visual images of the strikes. I think they took out some entrances to a what was I think that was a mountainous sort of facility, and it had multiple entrances and exits, and they took
Yeah,
out
they
those.
hit
Yes.
Natanz and Fordo.
Yeah.
Not
So
Oxford.
essentially, what is inside that, they just close access to it,
Right.
but a determined actor can still get in there and things like
Yes.
that.
Earth movers.
And what also came about in the aftermath of the 12-day war is Iran started, I think, signaling that the enriched material is somewhere buried in rubble and things like that. I mean, they were also not signaling that they had complete control of the enriched material and where exactly it was. I think they were also communicating ambiguity as to where it was and whether they had it,
Yeah.
and the status of it and so on. And I think that also made West panic, because you're talking about 440 kgs of 60% enriched uranium, right? So in the and then I'm coming back to Aditya's point about how US negotiates and whether you can trust US. And this is where I'm coming to the weeks preceding the current projectile war, right? We are transitioning from 2025 to 2026 now. So why did Iran, after so many failures in negotiations with the US, and that too with Trump walked away from JCPOA, right? Still try to reach a negotiated outcome. I think there were some talks happening with the help of Oman and in something in Europe in the weeks leading up to the actual projectile war. So, and I've read reports which say, and I'm sure there are multiple sides to it, because some of these negotiations always have multiple sides. That Iran was offering even major concessions like diluting down the 60% enriched uranium to a lower level, right? Which is no longer a concern, so on and so forth. Maybe it wanted some uh, in return. It wanted some concessions from US and Israel, so on and so forth. So my question to you is, despite all the history of these negotiations failing, of US not living up to its commitments and so on, why did Iran still negotiate with the US?
Well, I don't know why. We can speculate, but I think it's mostly about Iranian weakness.
Okay.
Iran is it's militarily weakened, especially after the June 2025 war. Its economy is a mess because of sanctions, and its limited ability to export oil. So Iran is a country suffering, for example, from high inflation. There is popular unrest in Iran. There have been a series of protests, including the ones
Yeah.
that took
Yeah.
place in January,
Yeah. Yeah.
which apparently thousands were killed.
Yeah.
So it is a politically, economically, and militarily weakened country, and it needs to buy time.
Hmm.
So I think when you consider those factors, it's not terribly surprising that Iran was seeking some sort of relief, even if it just meant getting a breather for a year or two.
So on 28th of February, that's the date, right? When
Yeah.
US and Israel struck Iran. Reports were that negotiations were still ongoing, and during that, you take out the supreme leader of a country, right? So now this is again a question as to what will happen in future when it comes to negotiations. Do you foresee, because of these assassinations of not just the supreme leader, but also other key figures in the military establishment, in the intelligence establishment, and the political establishment, during negotiations or just after negotiations, right, that Iran in future would be much more reluctant to believe in negotiations as a way to get the desired outcome?
Certainly. So one is there's just the fact that America keeps, basically, uh, America keeps undermining negotiations and does what it does. So that's one thing. So Iranians will think, will have to consider what the actual value of negotiating with the United States is. There's a second more practical matter, which is that for these meetings to take place, senior leadership has to move.
Yeah.
They have to be in conversation with each other. And if you're Iranian, you do have to wonder how the Americans might be using this to exploiting this
Yeah.
as an intelligence gold mine, right?
Correct.
To kill you later,
Correct.
which may have happened in
Yeah,
February.
correct.
So there's a lot of reasons for the Iranians to be really skeptical
Correct.
about dealing with the Americans. It doesn't mean they won't. At some point, the two
Yeah.
sides have to sit together. Apparently, they're doing something like that right now.
And
But
even if they don't sit together, let's say even if Iranian leadership decides, okay, getting all together in one room is too risky, even if they increase their digital communications,
sure,
that's also risky.
all of it.
All
Yes.
of it is risky, right?
Yes.
Right now, them making any move is risky,
Yes.
right? So yeah, definitely it can compromise them and then later be used to assassinate them also.
Yeah. See, the
Yeah.
thing is, I feel like any communication with the Americans now for Iran would be perceived as risky.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a risk that they were willing to take. The calculation would have been different earlier. But now
Okay.
there's just this repeated erosion of trust.
Hmm.
And I think with each of these instances for Iran, the incentive to believe the United States and believe in the power of arms control negotiation just goes down.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. So, for the benefit of listeners, maybe just a bit about technicality. So, natural uranium, as we find it in nature, is only has about 0.7% of uranium 235 U-235 isotope, which is the fissile material. You can use that fissile material to either run reactors. You can also use it for research purposes, medical purposes, and you can also, if you enrich it to let's say 90% or above, that's the generally agreed criteria, you can use it for weapons. In reactors, maybe 3 to 5% of enriched uranium. So that means in the uranium material that you have, about 3 to 5% will be uranium 235. That is used in running reactors, and bomb is 90% and above. Rest of most of the rest of uranium in natural uranium is uranium 238, which is fertile but not fissile. But you can still if you have particular set of facilities, you can transmute that and make plutonium out of it. Maybe we'll cover that plutonium bit also, Aditya, in some time. So right now there is about 440 kgs of 60% enriched uranium out on the loose. What I understand is getting from 0 to 60 is incredibly tough. Only few countries in the world have the capability of doing so. You need a host of centrifuges. You need to pack them in a particular assembly. You need to convert the natural uranium you're getting. You need to do a lot of processes, convert that into uranium hexafluoride, if I'm not wrong,
Yes.
Yeah.
and then run it, spin it, separate the heavier and the lighter parts, 235 and 238, and then separate it out, convert that gas again into metal, and then you get your hands on the bomb.
Yeah.
So it's an incredibly difficult
You
process.
don't get your hands on the bomb. You get your
You
hands.
get your hands on the
On the
material,
material.
which may
Material.
Yeah.
eventually turn into a bomb.
Yeah. And we'll come to how do we make a bomb, Aditya. Maybe you can do a one-on-one on that.
Wow.
So,
Tell the people at this time. Everybody
Yes.
wants to know.
So the thing is, right now they've gotten to 60%. They have done the difficult part. Getting from 60 to 90 technically is easier comparatively. But I think there's one thing that needs to be emphasized here. Even from getting to 60 to 90, you still need centrifuges. You still need a host of facilities that will help you with this enrichment and then further conversion of that gas to metal, and then you need to assemble a bomb, right? So I'm not sure whether after the 12-day war and after this projectile war, Iran still has the capability to do that sprint from 60 to 90. Based on what I've read, it seems if they want to do that sprint and if they still have some centrifuges somewhere hidden, which Israel and US don't know about, right? Or IAEA doesn't know about, then it will take some weeks to get to a stage where they have 90%. So I'll ask Adya to jump in here because I think Adya has done some remarkable work on this front. She has mapped out some scenarios as to what Iran's options are when it comes to future projections on what they'll do with the nuclear program given the current reality. So Adya, based on what you have been reading, what you have been seeing, what are the likely scenarios that you see going forward with the Iranian nuclear program?
Okay, before we get to that, on the centrifuges.
Okay.
So
Sure.
as of I think a couple of days ago, Netanyahu said that, Iran has no capability to use their centrifuges anymore. But the thing is, we don't know because nobody has eyes on the ground right now. Nobody who's not Iranian has eyes on the ground. We don't know. There's many, many question marks here. The IAEA says that even if the centrifuges are destroyed, Iran still has the capability to produce them. So then, there's another factor. If the industrial hubs are destroyed, then they may lose that capacity, which then stretches the timeline. But the knowledge again is still being retained. So I think here, if Iran does decide that they want to further enrich their uranium, it's a question of the timeline. It also depends on how long this war will drag along, what the state of their industry is, whether they have any other nuclear facilities that the IAEA isn't aware about that have an existing cascade of centrifuges. They have IR6 and IR9 centrifuges. The IR6 centrifuges, I think, would take them about 3 weeks to have enough enriched uranium for about 9 bombs. With IR9 centrifuges, a cascade of those, it's exponentially faster. So I think here then the question comes down to if there are, where there are, all of that. Coming to the scenarios, I think here Iranian leadership finds themselves in a difficult spot. On one hand, just the mere speculation that Iran is developing a bomb has it's placed them at the receiving end of all of these attacks, and whatever other interests the US may have in the region and whatever other ideas that Israel may have behind these strikes, the fact of the matter is what they started as a catalyst for all of this was Iran's nuclear program. I think one could say that perhaps by enriching to 60% and not trying to pursue the process further, Iran thought that they could use it as some sort of diplomatic leverage. Perhaps they could get relief from sanctions, use it as a bargaining chip in their discussions with the US. The thing is, clearly that didn't work because maybe they thought that wouldn't invite the strikes that it did, but Israel has demonstrated that it's quite willing to strike them even at the hint of a nuclear program.
Yeah.
So the way I see it, there's a few ways this could play out going forward. Iran has to do this cost-benefit analysis, of course, and decide what works best for them. But the hedging that they've done with enriching their uranium to a certain amount and then hoping that that gives them leverage is unlikely to be successful. Especially now when the war is already ongoing and Israel already has set out to destroy much of their nuclear program. So I'd say in an optimistic scenario for Iran and for everybody else, that would be the worst case scenario. Unfortunately, I don't think that's where we're at now. Then where I think what's more realistic are two ways it could play out. Firstly, Iran decides that it wants to go about developing a bomb. They decide they want to enrich their uranium, but there's too much internal turmoil. The leadership cannot garner the support it needs. It's not able to pull it off with enough internal support. Then perhaps Iran could still decide to develop the bomb. Iran could decide that it will enrich its uranium, all of that. It has the capacity, it can carry it out internally. But given the sheer state that its economy is in, and it's taken hit after hit with the sanctions, it could decide that, look, it's not worth it, and it could be talked into another deal that's a lot like the JCPOA. But I think the thing is, the part that makes me skeptical about that is that Iran has signed deals before, and I think if deals are not kept and if deals don't seem to hold any value, then they may be questioning that. Especially, so when Ayatollah Khomeini said that they didn't want to build a bomb, he put what they call, I think in Sharia law, they call it a fatwa on the bomb, which is basically a religious decree which says we will not develop or use nuclear weapons. So the marja, the person who gives the decree, once he passes away, the fatwa also no longer holds.
Okay.
And I think new leadership could then decide that, given that we're being attacked anyway based on speculations of the bomb, it might be more useful for us to actually have some credible deterrent capabilities, to be able to actually have a bargaining chip. And then that is a scary possibility if Iran were to consider this the way forward, where they quickly conduct an underground nuclear test, and this could potentially give them the security that they've been wanting for a while and could signal to their adversaries to back down. But I think this comes with the highest costs and risks for Iran because given that Israel is this willing to strike based on speculation of a bomb, if Iran were to actually conduct a nuclear test, it could be all-out war in.
Yeah.
I mean, this is already all-out war,
Yeah.
but it could lead to further escalation.
Hmm.
And if Israel does view Iran's nuclear program as an existential threat, as they've said time and again, I don't know what would happen if that nuclear program were actually to materialize in a form that could be dangerous for Israel. And I think it's this tough choice that Iranian leadership, I'm sure, must be grappling with, is likely to determine, I think, a lot of the relations between Israel, Iran and the US, but also the region as a whole. Because if Iran decides to make a dash for the bomb and conducts a test, Saudi Arabia could suddenly say, hey, we have a crisis in our backyard. What
Yeah.
are we going to do now? This is a major security concern. And I think that is a dangerous second order effect because
Yeah.
the entire region could then question their
Yeah.
policy on nuclear
Yeah.
weapons. Having said that, hopefully Iran sees the cost as being way too high to decide to pursue the bomb. But at this time, I don't know. I mean, Iran has already lost much of its leadership, lost much of its infrastructure. And at this point, I think the logic of having some leverage in this form I could understand how that would make sense.
Okay. Thanks, Adya. I think thanks for playing out those scenarios and what are the possibilities. We'll come to the war, all-out war thing, but before that, two quick questions for Aditya. First one is around 60% enriched uranium itself, right? I've read something that Iran doesn't necessarily need to get to 90. It can still maybe use 60% to build something unsophisticated. So maybe throw some light on that. What are the possibilities we're looking at?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I think the challenge there is, yes, it's theoretically possible. Only problem is you're going to need a lot more fissile material.
Okay.
You're going to need a lot more uranium, and what that means is your device is going to be very large,
Okay.
and it's not going to really be a weapon. It's going to be a device. Now the Iranians, one potential way of using this is to simply do an underground test,
Yeah.
and that could
Signal the capability. Yeah.
yeah, intent and
Yeah.
capability.
Yeah.
But to actually miniaturize, to make an effective weapon, they're going to have to enrich to over 90%, which they can, in theory, do in a few weeks, so long as they have this setup in place. And then you can actually make a device that maybe weighs about 1 ton that you can mate with one of your missiles, your MRBMs. So you to get there, you need to enrich uranium. There's no other way around that.
Okay. And one related question again, because we're speaking a lot about uranium, but there's one more candidate destroyer of the world out there, that is plutonium, right? And I think a lot of countries did use plutonium or considered the plutonium route. Why did Iran, maybe it considered, but why has Iranian nuclear program been dominated by uranium as opposed to the plutonium route? So theoretically, Iran could run even a small heavy water based reactor and put natural uranium, so you don't need to enrich anything, right? You are free from that burden. Run it through, and then get the spent fuel out.
Yes.
So what is happening is uranium 238. It's getting in situ transmuted into plutonium 239, and when you get the spent fuel out, you just you take the plutonium 239 out, store it, and you have and plutonium 239 is a good candidate also for making weapons. So why has Iran not gone that route, plutonium route? Why has it gone the uranium route?
That's an interesting question. I don't have definitive answers. Plutonium would seem like like an obvious choice. India has done that. Pakistan has done that. You can make a more elegant nuclear weapon out of it, essentially a so-called implosion device. But I think that firstly, the Iranians did have a heavy water reactor. They built it in the 90s. It was detected in the 2000s, early 2000s, and the Iranians essentially gave it away in negotiations.
Okay.
And certainly JCPOA itself was meant. One of the goals of that agreement was to block the plutonium route for Iran. So basically, Iran pledged not to go down the plutonium route, not to do the heavy water reactor. So that route was essentially blocked for the Iranians. The other thing is that the matter of enriching uranium became a point of political prestige in Iran, both domestically and internationally. And so I think the Iranians themselves were heavily focused on that. Uh, Also, finally, going the plutonium route reduces your deniability a lot, right? You can still claim with when you're enriching uranium that there are lots of other purposes for it, uh, not with plutonium. So I think there, are, I think it's this bunch of reasons, but
Also, I think Aditya, there's one more factor, and again, this is a guess. With uranium, you are getting from 0 to 90%. So there's a range of
correct.
enrichment, and you can play around that in negotiations, and it plays out over years. With plutonium 239, either you have it or you don't have it.
Yeah.
So it's an either or kind of a
Yeah,
situation.
it's an either or.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, you can also use that to bargain. You can bargain it away. In a
Yeah, you
sense, they
can.
did that.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
it's a mystery. I think Iran's nuclear program we'll understand more and more over the years to come.
So I'll move to the concluding question or concluding point, and again building on what Adya was saying about all-out war. My understanding is, and this is not just alone my understanding. Whatever I'm reading, experts across the world are saying, you cannot do regime change through air. So you can't bomb a country out of, at least Iran. You can't bomb it out of to so that regime change happens. So that's not happening. And the signs that we see right now are not indicative that the regime is going anywhere. Right? It's still there. It's resilient. Uh, and then what I'm also understanding is that because this 440 kgs of enriched uranium, we don't know where it is, how it has been stored, whether Iranians themselves have access to it right now, so on and so. There are a host of questions. So the only way US and Israel can get their hands onto it and secure it, that can't be through air, that can't be through bombing alone. That has to involve some ground component, right? And the moment you send a ground component, it's going to be a massive, I don't know, it's already massive, but it's going to be
Yeah.
even more massive undertaking, and it's going to involve a ground component. Like, it will be more war kind of thing, as opposed to just projectiles flying here and there, right? So it will be like a traditional war then.
It's a civil engineering undertaking, really,
Okay,
to
interesting.
dismantle these things and
Yeah.
remove that, right? I mean,
But to get that civil engineering thing set up
that's why.
around those
So,
facilities, you
so that
need
that
a.
requires a massive military component, a land component
Do
to
you
it.
see that? I mean, what's your take? Do you see that happening? Is it possible?
It's possible, of course, it's possible.
Is it likely?
But likely, I don't know what's in Donald Trump's head, but I think that's the least likely option.
That's the least likely option.
Yeah.
Okay. Adya, do you concur or?
Again, can't tell what Donald Trump is thinking. I don't think he can either. He, in the same speech, he's gone and said, we're winning Iran, we've destroyed everything, we want help with Iran, we're going to wrap it up. Like, there's a lot of
Yeah.
confusing signaling happening here. But I do think putting boots on the ground would be a massive, massive thing for the United States to commit to.
Yeah.
And it's very well to be launching missiles from your bases, but I think that's a completely different level of escalation that I'm not sure even Trump would be willing to undertake as of now.
So
Especially because there's no guarantee once
Yeah.
you get your boots on the ground
yeah.
that you'll have your engineers digging around in the
Yeah.
rubble looking for
What if
uranium.
it's not there?
Yeah,
What if it's
exactly.
not
Like,
there?
you don't know. There's so
Yeah.
many unknown variables here. So I don't know if I see it as a highly
So
unlikely
US
scenario.
is looking at two unfavorable options right now. If it goes in there, it's going to be a bloodbath, and they may not even still get all the canisters or all the stored uranium, enriched uranium. If they don't get in, and if this war is projectile war is concluded in some other way, then the Iranians still maybe have access to that 440 kgs, and they can still make a dash for things, and they can still make it difficult for US and Israel in the future, right? They can still get their hands on the bomb. So I mean, they're looking at very unfavorable scenarios unless there is a negotiated outcome where Iran is offered major concessions, right?
Yeah.
And that brings lasting peace to the region.
Yeah, I mean, the only potential way out of this is another grand bargain.
Another grand bargain.
So it's one where both sides prescribe their behavior in some ways and come to a broader deal because
Yeah.
you need buy-in within the region as well. It's very hard because Israel has maximalist goals, and I think Iran also now has maximalist goals.
Okay.
So
I think until now, Iran was much more willing to take the short end of the stick. But at this point, especially with how wildly not credible previous deals have been, it makes sense if Iran now wants to go all out.
Thank you so much, Aditya and Adya, for joining me today. I think it was a very informative, and we covered about 40-50 years of history. We covered what happened last year and what's happening now. And then we also discussed some scenarios going forward. I think the main takeaway is something that you said at the end, right? That there needs to be a grand bargain, and that alone can bring lasting peace, I think, to this region. With that note, we'll conclude this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.